Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Justice, Langford, Mullen, Hall, Sheehy, Thune, Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Durbin, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kelly, Kim, Lujan, Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Rono, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Banks, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Miss Lummis, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Tillis, aye.
Nobody ever wants to do it.
Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no.
Somebody has to have the skill. Special skill.
Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders, no.
The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Clerk will report.
The undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22, the standing rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I ask the Senate execute the order of February 13th in relation to the Lutnick nomination.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick of New York to be Secretary.
The questions on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, I got you. No, I'm. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell.
I do think it would be a mistake, though, for us to take the tax cuts. If we had a massive tax increase, it would hurt GDP.
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy.
I'm up. Mary Ann, you got me?
I do, thank you. I got you.
So,
Thank you.
nobody can object to it.
Thank you.
That I suggested that the tax cuts were speaking.
I got it.
Have a stimulus bill.
Thank you. I did.
That, the tax foundation is
Thank
most
you.
aligned with where our leadership is and all the way over here. And folks over here say it hurts us because it crowds out.
Thank you.
That crowds out private borrowing. And folks
Ms. Collins.
bang for the buck.
Mr. Coons.
Corporate tax rates permanent.
Mr. Cornyn.
And so that's where the
Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis.
people like tax funding,
Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth.
the debt to
Mr. Durbin.
that we're in
Ms. Ernst.
charter territory
Mr. Fetterman.
has the potential
Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego.
within 20 to 30
Mrs. Gillibrand.
to take our account.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
So now
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. I got you. Mr. Hawley.
basis, upper income is going to get a 2.9% improvement.
Mr. Heinrich.
And everybody from 0 to 60%
Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono.
quintiles is going to get at best a 1%, sometimes less than 1% increase.
Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde Smith.
So there is the
Mr. Johnson.
child tax credit, which
Mr. Justice.
right actually a tax cut, it's just welfare. But and that obviously
Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly.
so whereas the
Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim.
at least the second
Mr. King.
and so
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee.
skewed to upper income. Now you know what I guess to go back to the that's
Thanks.
because the taxes are skewed.
Mr. Lujan.
You're giving the people paying taxes. Half of Americans don't pay
Ms. Lummis.
definition. Someone who's at zero, they don't pay income tax.
Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall.
Or many, not everybody, but many. Yeah, they're paying payroll taxes, they're paying workers,
Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick.
excise taxes, etc. Gasoline.
Mr. Merkley.
So,
Mrs. Moody.
but if you look, for example,
Mr. Moran.
to 40% quintile,
Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski.
obviously
Mr. Murphy.
paying payroll tax.
Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff.
You know what I keep on thinking though? For the politics,
Mr. Padilla.
I went back and looked at the politics.
Mr. Paul.
We got slaughtered after the 2017
Mr. Peters.
in the midterm. We thought we were going to get a super
Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts.
majority in the Senate,
Mr. Risch.
and we gained one seat. They had
Ms.
two,
Rosen. Mr. Rounds.
and we got one seat. And then we lost the House.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz.
And that's because people did not see
Mr. Schiff.
from the TCJA in their life.
Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer.
We're not even giving them a tax cut, we're just maintaining it to the degree that we're not cutting it to be a 1%.
Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
And what keeps coming to my mind,
Mrs. Shaheen.
and you said it so well, and I'll never get it.
Mr. Sheehy.
Fox Canyon, da 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 da. We're going to drive into this box.
Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan.
And
Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis.
on and on. And
Mr. Tuberville.
the water gets slaughtered again politically.
Mr. Van Hollen.
I don't see preserving a 1%, keeping people from 1% tax cut
Mr. Warner.
when distributionally people
didn't, thank you.
are going to get a 3% tax cut.
Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Collins, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Ricketts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Hickenlooper, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. No. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Oh, hey. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. I have you. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Capito, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 45, and the nomination is confirmed. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that with respect to the Lutnick nomination, the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 13, S-Con Res 7.
The question occurs on the motion to proceed. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Thank you. She did. Thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. I got you, Capito. Yeah, okay. I got you. I like your jacket. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. You're welcome, of course, Mr. Durbin. Yeah, I got him. I know. I got you, Senator.
Well, there you go. Live from the Senate floor in Washington, D.C. It's official. Howard Lutnick is the next U.S. Commerce Secretary. Of course, he'll be sworn in the matter of days now, as he is already a guy that knows what's up when it comes to business, the economy, tariffs, trade, and on. Out of New York, a great businessman, and now someone that will continue his great efforts and exploits that he's done over the years for business. He's going to continue that for our country. Howard Lutnick is the next U.S. Commerce Secretary, another great pick from the Trump administration. You could stay with RSBN Live throughout the night when it comes to Truth Social, X, online as well. If there are any America First breaking news stories or any stories outside of the Beltway, we'll have that for you. Also, tomorrow, we have a number of live events that will happen. President Trump will be speaking in Miami. Also, the Secretary of Labor confirmation will be in the morning. Also, keeping an eye on the final vote we've all been waiting for Kash Patel with the FBI. That's not happening today. That may happen tomorrow. We'll keep our eye on the Senate schedule. So for all of us here at Right Side Broadcasting Network, for Robert McNeely, Ashley Brassfield, Christina Loren, myself, Matthew Alvarez, you'll see a lot of coverage coming up this week from CPAC. We'll also cover a lot of news out of Washington, D.C., and any other breaking news that happens right here on RSBN Live. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon.
Welcome to Right Side Broadcasting Network, your trusted conservative news outlet. At RSBN, we deliver the truth when the mainstream media falls short. Since 2015, we've proudly broadcasted every single one of President Trump's iconic MAGA rallies, bringing you the excitement and energy live before anyone else. By watching RSBN, you get an unfiltered front row view of the action on the ground. We interview the crowds to give a voice to millions of Americans just like you. We show you President Trump's speeches in their entirety, free from interruptions and censorship. We cover the stories that matter to you with the integrity and passion you deserve. Thank you for choosing RSBN as your home for America First News. Together, we stand strong, united, and informed. So join us and be part of the right side of history.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our first ever mega sale on overstock clearance and brand new products. For example, save over 50% on this season's flannel sheets. Queen size only $59.98. Kings only $69.98. They sell out fast every year, so order now. Save 20% on our brand new My Crosses. They're designed in the likeness of the one I've worn every day for over 20 years. They come in men's and women's, and they're made right here in the USA. Get our 2025 six-piece My Towel sets for only $29.98. Our initial quantities are extremely low, so get them now before they go. And our best-selling standard My Pillows, just $14.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use this promo code to take advantage of our first ever mega sale. But wait, remember that $75 free shipping rule? Well, that ship is sailed because right now, every order ships absolutely free.
Hey y'all, it's Silk from the Diamond and Silk Chit Chat Live Show. Look, don't forget to check me out right here on RSBN Network. Be sure to watch the show on Right Side Broadcasting Network, and I want you to support Right Side Broadcasting Network. Yes, it's imperative that you do so, okay? I look to see y'all soon. Bye-bye.
Families across the nation have arrived at a heartbreaking crossroad to surrender their beloved animals at alarming rates due to inflation and soaring costs of living.
There are so many overcrowded shelters. So many dogs need a home, but it's all of us working together to solve this crisis.
This fight requires both doers and dollars. Join us at Big Dog Ranch Rescue. Please sign up today.